Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the Robert Durst case? Other questions here would be, is he guilty of murder? And is he a serial killer? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. So first I'll look at the background of Robert Durst. I'll move to the timeline of the crimes, and then I'll offer my analysis. Starting with the background, Robert Durst was born in New York City on April 12, 1943. He was raised in Scarsdale, New York. His father was named Seymour and his mother Bernice. Durst was the eldest of 4 children. His grandfather, Joseph Durst, was a successful real estate investor. He founded the Durst Organization, a company that owns and manages many commercial buildings. Robert Durst's father, Seymour, took over the company in 1974 after Joseph died. Durst's mother would die as a result of falling off of or jumping off of the roof of their family home in Scarsdale when Durst was 7 years old. Sometime later, Durst claimed that he saw his mother standing on the roof of the house because his father took him to the window to show him. His brother Douglas disputes this claim. Durst did not get along with Douglas very well. They were even sent to counseling when they were children to help them better manage their relationship. In school, Durst mostly kept to himself. He graduated from high school and went to Lehigh University. He would graduate from there in 1965 with a bachelor's degree in economics. That same year, he would enroll in a doctoral program at UCLA, but he dropped out and returned to New York. In 1971, he started dating a woman named Kathy McCormick. They briefly lived in Vermont and operated a health food store before moving back to New York. Durst went to work as a real estate developer in the family business. He married Kathy in 1973. Kathy wanted to be a pediatrician and was in her 4th year of medical school. Durst and Kathy were having difficulty in the relationship. They were arguing frequently. Evidently, Durst was dating another woman. Sometime in December 1982, Kathy was treated for bruises on her face at a hospital in the Bronx. Kathy wanted a divorce, including a $250,000 settlement. After hearing this, Durst took several efforts to separate Kathy financially, including discontinuing payments for her medical school tuition, removing her name from a joint bank account, and canceling her credit card. Now moving to the timeline of the crimes. This brings us to January 31, 1982. Kathy unexpectedly arrives at a dinner party in Connecticut wearing sweatpants and appearing upset. I guess she didn't normally wear sweatpants. After leaving the party, she was supposed to meet a friend at a pub in Manhattan. Kathy never arrived, and the friend notified the police. Robert Durst filed a missing person report a few days after this. Durst claimed that on the night Kathy disappeared, the two were arguing and alcohol was involved. Kathy wanted to go to Manhattan to an apartment that the couple owned, but Durst would not let her take the car, so he drove her to the train station and dropped her off. He claimed that he called her later that evening and she was at the apartment. He changed his story twice regarding where he placed that call from. A doorman at the building where the apartment was located initially claimed that he saw Kathy arrive at the apartment on February 1, but she was a block and a half away and her back was turned. Later reports indicate the doorman never saw her and may not have even worked in the building that day. On February 4, an individual claiming to be Kathy called a supervisor at Kathy's medical school and said that she wasn't feeling well. She would be missing class for a week. Durst offered a reward of $100,000 for the return of his wife, but later he modified that amount to $15,000. I'm not sure I've ever seen this. What message does this really send? Usually the person posting the reward is desperate for information. Like if somebody approached Durst and said, "I'll give you the information about Kathy's disappearance for $100,000, he would say, "No deal. How much will $15,000 buy me?" Some years later, Kathy was declared dead. Durst married again on December 11, 2000. At the time of making this video, the investigation into Kathy's disappearance is active, but no arrests have been made. Now we move to December 24, 2000, to an area of Los Angeles, California called Benedict Canyon. The neighbors of a woman named Susan Berman notice that the back door of her house is open and her 3 dogs are loose. They call the police, who found Berman dead with a single gunshot wound to the back of her head. There was no sign of forced entry. The Beverly Hills Police Department received a handwritten note a few days later. It was postmarked December 23. It listed Berman's address and the word cadaver. On the front of the envelope, the name Beverly was misspelled. It was spelled L-E-Y instead of L-Y. Susan Berman had been a friend of Durst for quite some time. He met her when he was in that doctoral program in the late 60s. It has been theorized that Berman may have known something about Kathy's disappearance, like perhaps she was the one that called that medical school impersonating Kathy. Durst had recently given $50,000 to Berman, which may have been to keep her quiet. Durst was in California when Berman was killed and flew out of San Francisco the night before her body was discovered. At some point in the year 2000, Durst had moved to a boarding house in Galveston, Texas. He was dressing as a woman and using an alias. This takes us to September 2001. The police in Galveston find the torso and limbs of a 71-year-old man named Morris Black. It doesn't take them long to figure out that Black was the neighbor of Robert Durst. They arrested Durst, but he posted bail the next day and missed his next court hearing. About a month and a half later, he was arrested in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, after he was caught shoplifting a newspaper, a chicken salad sandwich, and Band-Aids. In his vehicle, the police found 2 firearms, cannabis, the driver's license of Morris Black, and $37,000 in cash. Durst was extradited to Texas not long after this, but it wasn't until 2003 when his trial would begin. The prosecution's case was fairly straightforward. Durst was Black's neighbor. Durst was on the run due to his wife's disappearance in New York. He was dressed as a woman. He was using aliases. He had a bow saw in his vehicle when he was arrested for the first time in Galveston. And of course he had Morris Black's driver's license on him when he was arrested in Pennsylvania. It was as strong a case one could hope for, short of getting a confession or capturing something on video. Durst hired a high-powered defense team. Their strategy was a bit more circuitous. It went something like this. Morris Black was a troubled, dangerous individual with a checkered past. Durst was only on the run because of an unfair prosecutor in New York who was out to get him for political reasons. Black initiated a physical confrontation with Durst and retrieved a .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol that Durst owned. Black pointed the weapon at Durst. Durst tried to get it away from him, and the pistol magically discharged, and amazingly the bullet happened to strike Black in the face, killing him. Durst examined his own situation at that moment and concluded that any reasonable person would believe he was guilty. Therefore, he dismembered the body and got rid of it in Galveston Bay. Incredibly, he was found not guilty of murder. In December 2004, he did plead guilty to evidence tampering and bail jumping, so he was sentenced to prison and released in 2005. After his release, he took an unauthorized trip to the boarding house where Black had been shot and to a shopping mall where he encountered the trial judge. Because he did not have permission to be there, he was returned to prison until March of 2006. This takes us to 2015. HBO had a documentary series titled The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst. Against the advice of his attorneys, Durst was interviewed for the documentary, and he supplied them with various types of documentation. The filmmakers were given a letter from Berman's stepson that inculpated Robert Durst. The final episode involved a tense interview with Durst, during which he was confronted with a letter that he wrote to Susan Berman that appeared to have the same handwriting as that anonymous letter sent to the Beverly Hills Police Department. The name Beverly was misspelled the same way on both documents. After the interview, Durst went into the bathroom, but he was still wearing the microphone. Among other things, he said to himself in the bathroom, "There it is, you are caught." He also said, "What did I do? Killed them all." Of course. The filmmakers did not discover that recording until months later. In March of 2015, the FBI arrested Robert Durst in New Orleans, Louisiana. He was using an alias and carrying a fake ID, a new cell phone, a latex mask that was flesh-toned, his birth certificate, his passport, various maps including one of Cuba, and $42,000. It seems like a kit that somebody would assemble to guarantee a judge was not going to set bail. Durst eventually was charged by the federal government for carrying an illegal weapon. He would plead guilty to that charge and was sentenced to 85 months in prison. He was, of course, still facing trial for the murder of Susan Berman in California. In December of 2019, his defense team admitted that Durst wrote the note to the Beverly Hills Police Department. They said that it only proved he knew Berman was dead, not that he killed her. Durst probably wished that he had not said on a prior occasion that whoever wrote that note to the police was the killer. His trial started in March of 2020, but it was postponed because of coronavirus. At the time I'm making this video, the trial of Robert Durst for the murder of Susan Berman is set to resume in April of 2021. Now moving to the mental health and personality factors. Durst was described as being a loner. He stood out for being unusual, but he generally functioned well enough to get by, especially when he was younger. He had a traumatic loss of his mother when he was 7, and that contentious relationship with his brother Douglas. So there were some different occurrences in his childhood that were quite stressful. In 1953, a mental health professional said that Durst may have had personality decomposition and possibly even schizophrenia. In 1992, Douglas was selected to run the family company by Durst's father. Durst was not happy about this and even filed a lawsuit. It was the unusual behavior of Durst that resulted in this decision. During his time working in the family business, some of his behaviors drew negative attention. For example, he would mumble to himself during meetings, and he kept a wrench in his desk, presumably for self-defense. There were also reports that he urinated in garbage cans. We know that in July of 2014, years after he was no longer working in the family business, he was arrested for urinating on a candy rack at a Houston drugstore. During the trial for the murder of Morris Black in Galveston, a mental health expert hired by the defense said that Durst had Asperger's syndrome, which is now referred to as autism spectrum disorder. Asperger's syndrome was conceptualized as a mild version of autism. Before the trial was postponed, we learned that the prosecution believed that Durst had an acute mental health condition, but the defense maintained he had no serious mental condition. There doesn't appear to be any consensus as to what's going on with Durst in terms of mental health. Of course, only a professional who evaluates him in person could know with any level of certainty, but here are a few theories of what could be going on in a situation like this. Autism spectrum disorder is a possibility, and it could explain some of his odd mannerisms, like the social detachment, but it does not explain the murder, public urination, antagonism, deceptive behavior, paranoia, and his ability to stay calm under pressure. Schizophrenia doesn't seem like a good explanation either. Often the symptoms of this disorder are fairly obvious, like hallucinations and delusions. As far as the so-called personality decomposition mentioned by the professional who assessed him in 1953, that's not a term used in mental health. I don't know what the professional was talking about. I guess that's what happens if you take a personality out of the freezer and leave it in the hot sun for several days. I'm not sure. One of the things I've mentioned before in other videos when talking about older mental health diagnoses, like ones that were assigned in the 50s, is that mental health professionals made up a lot of terms back then. They said really whatever came to mind. There was little standardization. The first version of the DSM, the manual that describes various mental disorders, was published in 1952, but it took many years to be accepted by the treatment community. Other possible explanations for the actions of Durst have been brought up as well. Three that come to mind would be narcissism, psychopathy, and cluster A personality features. Narcissism could explain why Durst feels entitled to commit crimes, and why he wanted to do the interview for the documentary, even though it was a bad idea from a legal perspective. Psychopathy could explain his ability to manipulate, his lack of empathy, deceptive behavior, coldness, irresponsibility, impulsivity, and criminal behavior. Cluster A personality pathology includes symptoms from three disorders: paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorders. Cluster A features could explain the isolation, the look of detachment, poor relationship with his family, paranoia, odd mannerisms, social awkwardness, eccentric behavior, while at the same time it is consistent with his ability to function. It seems as though Durst highly prioritized his own desires. He had a recognition of right and wrong. He knew when people would be happy or unhappy with his behavior, but he put a heavy weight on his own needs and almost no weight on the needs of others and the demands of society in general. It's almost like narcissism combined with impulsiveness. What was different about Durst, as opposed to many other similar criminals, was his wealth and intelligence. He was able to get away with a lot more because he had money and because people thought he was rational. He was an extremely effective liar. There was one ability in particular that stood out with Durst. When he was being questioned, he was able to see how others viewed his behavior and side with them. He would apply his skepticism to himself. This isn't always a good tactic, but in his situation it paid off. For example, during his trial in Galveston, he was able to acknowledge how bad it looked that he dismembered the body, instead of just saying, "Oh no, that's what anybody would do after a self-defense situation." He acknowledged that it made him look guilty. So he kind of moved over to the side of the jury and was looking at it as if he was sitting with them, commiserating about how strange that appeared. Somehow that attitude was convincing to the jury. I think the way he talked to himself, as we saw in the last episode of the documentary The Jinx, is what allowed him to experiment with different statements and responses in order to appear empathic, in order to understand the perspective of others. He would have a dialogue with himself, which he believed would mirror a conversation with another person. So he may be able to logically understand someone else's perspective, but he may not be able to know how they truly feel. So he may have cognitive empathy, but not affective empathy. Now moving to the last questions, do I think he is guilty, and is he a serial killer? I do think that Durst was guilty of all 3 murders. I'm curious to see the outcome of the trial for the murder of Susan Berman. Is Robert Durst a serial killer? Well, if he is guilty, then technically he would be a serial killer, but he's not a typical one. Durst allegedly killed 3 people that he knew. He was quite close to Kathy and Susan, and he knew Morris Black a little bit. Serial killers usually target strangers. Also, his motive wasn't any type of domination. His motive for killing Kathy appears to be money, and his motive after that was to cover up the first murder. There's one other element that could change all of this, though. Durst is suspected in the disappearances of an 18-year-old woman in Vermont in 1971 and an 18-year-old woman and a 16-year-old girl in California in the 90s. These are 3 separate cases that seem to suggest a more traditional serial killer profile. My final thoughts in this case: Durst is a good example of how the combination of wealth, criminal tendencies, and poor police investigations lead to destruction. Those are my thoughts on the Robert Durst case. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be interesting. Thanks for watching.